Chapter 2, Part 2, Ethics and Corporate Social Responsibility. In the background, you see a bit about Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, which radically changed how people viewed industries such as the meatpacking industry, and really led to a sea change in consumer product safety, specifically in terms of food. So we'll look at some of the changes, the legal changes that came about because of The Jungle and because of the progressive movement. Indeed, prior to The Jungle, the attitude was caveat emptor, which is let the buyer beware. And as detailed in that book, that had some pretty horrifying consequences. So the idea of caveat emptor was that the buyer was responsible if they bought milk for their kids and it was tainted blue because it had so many contaminants in it. Well, that was their issue. However, as I said, largely because of Upton Sinclair's book and because of the progressive movement, there was more of a realization that there is a role for government in terms of making sure that food is safe and that workers are treated decently. So you see some of the major provisions that came about during that time. The Great Depression also ushered in quite a bit of change, and specifically the idea that corporations and government should be more responsive to society. The economic model of social responsibility originated in the 18th century, and that is the notion that a company is not solely responsible for making a profit, but they should also be contributing something positive to society, that business should be concerned with its impact and try to do the best thing that it can. So here's a bit on the two views of corporate social responsibility. And as you look at this, I know the W through Z last name group has Uber, but for the rest of you, I would ask you to think, where does Uber fall on this model? Do they have the economic viewpoint or the socioeconomic emphasis? So let's look at some pros and cons of social responsibility. One thing that's worth making is from a PR standpoint, makes a lot of sense. We are in a fishbowl. If a company does something wrong, case in point, Uber among others, it spreads around the world pretty much instantaneously. You can't really get away with things that you could in yesteryear. The con is that being socially responsible is definitely not cheap. So here's a bit on consumerism and consumer bill of rights, and a bit on consumer protection laws and major federal legislation. These are major federal legislation from 1960 to 1994, and this is from 1977 to 2010. So you can see there's been, from the early 1900s onwards, there's really been a sea change in terms of more commitment to the rights of the consumer, to the rights of the employees. The question is now, people are asking, has the pendulum swung too far? Is it reasonable to say in New York that you can't order a big gulp, or is that not reasonable? But nonetheless, whatever your point of view may be, you should be aware of some of the changes, especially affecting employment law. One of the terms to be aware of, there's really been a move away from this, but you should be aware of the term affirmative action and what that means. And you can see a definition here. And you should also be aware of what the EEOC is. And we'll come back to the EEOC in the HR or Human Resources chapter. But for now, be aware that the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the government entity that will address allegations of discrimination. So those allegations could be based on gender discrimination, could be based on religion, could be based on country of origin, could be based on ethnicity, etc. One of the terms that I think that comes up on the test is what are the hardcore unemployed? And those are folks that have very little educational training but have been unemployed for quite a long period of time. As an employer, especially an employer in California, things are more challenging than in years past because there's so little tolerance for harassment in the workplace. And this is interesting. I don't know if you saw the news recently, the payout that Fox News had to put up for allegations of sexual harassment against Bill O'Reilly. The payout was $13 million, which is quite stiff. Of course, he is denying wrongdoing, but it's a significant payout. Another area to be aware of are environmental concerns. So one of the trends that we're seeing now in terms of corporate social responsibility is to perform a social audit, to ask, much like an accounting audit says, let's look at our accounting. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Social audit looks at how the company is impacting society in all these different areas. How are we doing in terms of employment? How are we doing in terms of the environment? And to really audit that to report back in terms of what is the impact, positive or negative. And as you can see, especially in terms of environmental impact, that's certainly well needed. You see some of the changes, much like we saw before, changes in employment law. There have also been very significant changes in environmental laws. And thank God LBCC is caught up on this, and we're finally recycling, despite my asking us to do that 16 years ago. Another phenomenon that we'll come back to perhaps in the marketing chapter is the idea of green marketing, which is the promise of delivering environmentally friendly materials. And then I want to leave you with another link, which kind of addresses a little bit more fully what is corporate social responsibility.